Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to tonight's edition of the Robust Opposition. I'm really happy to bring you a North Carolina, well, actually a Southern-focused show tonight, because we're going to be talking about the Poor People's Campaign. And with me are Leslie Boyd and Evan Richardson, who are the two co-directors of the Poor People's Campaign here in Western North Carolina. Welcome to my show, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. Glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad I could put you in because you are having a very important event next week in Raleigh, and we're going to talk about that event and why it's so important that anyone who can make it there, get on the bus. You're having some buses. And but first, I want to talk to the viewers who may not be familiar with the Poor People's Campaign, to talk about how it got started. It's an outgrowth of the Moral Monday movement that started here with Reverend William Barber in North Carolina. And Leslie, you were involved from the very beginning. So why don't you tell us about the Poor People's Campaign and what it's all about?
Well, we started off on April 29th, 2013. By 17 people went into the North Carolina Legislature building. We had all been trying to make appointments with legislators to talk about laws they were passing, and they wouldn't see us. So 17 people went in and all got arrested. A week later, 24 people went in, all got arrested. The third week, I was part of that one. There were 49 of us. And over the course of 13 weeks, 1,003 people were arrested. And we changed the narrative. We talked about immigrants not being bad and gay people not being horrible and poor people not being immoral. And that really has kind of been the object of this all along. When you tell people's stories and then point to, this is what happens when you make bad public policy. If you tell the stories and show the faces, you begin to change the narrative. And the Poor People's Campaign grew out of that. When we had, after the end of Moral Mondays, the following February, we had another of our annual rallies in Raleigh. And we had between 80,000 and 100,000 people there. People are just so eager to hear what we have to say, because you're hearing so much negative stuff about poor people, about immigrants, about workers, that when you meet them and you hear their stories, you begin to think, wait a minute, something's not right here. Nobody should have to live like that. And that's why we tell the stories of impacted people. When we gather in Raleigh on March 28th for another Moral Monday, which we'll talk more about later, we're going to be telling the stories. People are going to be telling their own stories. I started off telling the story of how my son died because he couldn't get health care, and his doctors knew he would die, and they let it happen. And that led me to become an activist. But this movement has kind of maintained that. And with the success of the Moral Monday movement, we took it around the state. We appeared in a whole bunch of cities. And Reverend Barber and Reverend Liz Theoharis, who's the co-founder of this Poor People's Campaign, decided that it should be done not on a national level, but on a grassroots level. And so each state has its own structure. Even though we come together nationally, each state has its own structure and its own coordinating committee, its own chairs, its own agenda, its own projects. And we come together on all these basic premises of, battling these intersecting evils of that cause almost half of Americans to live in poverty or near poverty. 41% of Americans say if they got a bill for $400, they couldn't pay it without borrowing money. That's not a very secure household.
Yeah.
And we need to change that. So that's what this is.
Yeah, and there was an article in the Los Angeles Times, I think it was about 2 years ago, that said There is not one city in America where someone making a minimum wage could afford a one-bedroom apartment, paying 30% of their income for rent, which is supposed to be, the guideline.
It's
Evan,
even more true. It's
yes,
even more true today because wages are still stagnant and rents and mortgages are just skyrocketing. There's housing crises everywhere and wages are still stagnant. So yeah, it's a real problem.
I want to talk about, the political activity in a little bit, but first I want to give Evan a chance to talk about how she got involved with the Poor People's Campaign, the Moral Mondays, and this righteous cause.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. I actually was aware of Moral Mondays happening, and so many times wished that I could just, um, you know, call out sick or take time off from my job and get on the bus and go to Moral Monday, and it just never quite worked out for me. And then in 2019, actually went to a moral assembly that was held in DC of the Poor People's Campaign, and over 1,000 people gathered from all over the country and Puerto Rico and other, um, I guess, territories, right, that are historically managed by the United States. And what was so remarkable is this gathering. The Poor People's Campaign intentionally invited all of the presidential candidates. Some of the Democratic candidates came, and I was just so stunned by the power of the message, the consistency of the message, and different individuals whose lives have been impacted by the issues that they spoke to stood up and asked questions of the candidates. And then Dr. Barber and Dr. Thea Harris both made sure that each candidate was asked, what are you going to do to make sure the issues of poverty get before the debate? And it was just such a consistent message. And it felt like there was such power in that room. There was so much wisdom in that room. There was a strategy, a well-developed strategy. And I walked away with this sense of hope like I haven't had in years. And I came home and reached out to Leslie and said, hey, how can I help? And so I've been a part of it ever since. And I have not looked back.
Well, that's awesome.
I put her to work.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about some of the things that you've done here in Western North Carolina. But first, I want to talk about the principles of the Poor People's Campaign. The website is extremely specific when you go on it and you see the preamble and the principles, for instance. They talk about Part 1, establish justice and end systemic racism, the right to democracy and equal protection under the law. Part 2, promote the general welfare, the right to welfare and an adequate standard of living. Part 3, ensure domestic tranquility, the right to work with dignity. Part 4, secure the blessings of liberty, the right to health and a healthy environment. Part 5, provide for the common defense, reprioritizing our resources. And right now, at this point in time, with this war in Ukraine, I'm thinking about Part 5 because, Joe Biden and the administration, the Congress for that matter, basically took away the COVID money that was supposed to go to the states. And within a period of 2 weeks, they've managed to come up with $1 billion for arms and aid to Ukraine. And I'm thinking about that and how Reverend Barber would feel about that, what he would say about that, as he goes around talking about how we need Medicare for all and $15 minimum wage, reprioritizing our resources right now. It seems very difficult to get the national consensus. And I want to ask you, why do you think it's so hard for the people not to flock to this message, which just seems so elementary when, as you say, almost 50% of Americans don't have $400 in the bank to pay for an emergency. 50% of Americans are one accident, illness, or job loss away from dire poverty. And yet, everything you see in the media right now is, oh, those poor Ukrainians. I'm interested in your opinions about that, both of you.
Well, I think we're a little hypocritical in the way we should criticize Putin. What he's doing is bad. But what did we do in Iraq and Afghanistan? And people they're primed to want this revenge, the propaganda is very scientifically developed and targeted. And so they know what they're doing to get people's support for these wars. And all these wars are doing is enriching, the already way too wealthy. So I would say Reverend Barber can speak for himself, of course. I personally think that we've been very hypocritical, and there has to be a better way, and we need to start insisting on finding it.
Well, this has a lot of parallels to me with, Martin Luther King at the end of his life. He did that great Beyond Vietnam speech.
Oh, yeah.
When he started speaking against the war, people almost turned against him. I mean, they were fine when he was talking about civil rights, but when he started, organizing the Poor People's March on Washington, where he was assassinated, and even in Memphis, Tennessee, he was siding with the sanitation workers, many of whom were white, and they were planning on this Poor People's March to Washington, which is similar to what you guys are doing in June. So I know we're going to talk about next week, but maybe we could skip ahead, because this thing was announced several months ago. I remember covering it with you, Leslie.
Yeah.
A lot of notice you've given. So this is just, it's getting closer. It's going to be in June. Talk about that event before we talk about next week's event.
It's
June
going to be
18th.
so much fun.
Saturday, June 18th. So I think
Yes.
it's really important to point out that it is intentionally scheduled around the time of Juneteenth, which is the day of the year in which African Americans that were living in Texas finally found out about freedom 2 years after the fact.
Yeah, it was in Galveston.
Yeah. And so it is going to be, I think it's going to has the potential to be as big as gatherings in DC that were led by Martin Luther King, coming together partners from all over the country, mobilizing, and as Leslie had mentioned, to stand up and speak to the fact that more than almost 50% of people living in the United States are poor or low wealth. And kind of to talk a little bit about what you were saying, Lauren, earlier is, and that story is not told. That story is under the radar. Instead, we hear about the fear of crime that's happening, and other things that are happening that actually are, the Ukraine war. Of course, that's something that we all should be concerned about, and the work that what Putin is doing is not okay. But we do not talk about the suffering that is happening every day in our communities, where we have in North Carolina. It's immoral that nearly 26 to 29% of the children in North Carolina lived in food insecure homes, live in homes where their parents do not have a stable job. Like, that is not okay. It's not okay that we have
Exactly.
over 60% of the people that are incarcerated in the state are African American and BIPOC, and many of them then will lose their right to vote. It's not okay that we have more registered Democrats in the state, but the representation in Congress, because of the gerrymandering and the voter suppression, is that we have both a North Carolina legislature that's enacting laws that hurt poor people, white and BIPOC. So the June 16th is to bring poor people and allies to the DC, so we can stand up and speak to Congress and say,
With
it's time.
one voice.
One voice. We need federal living wage that would be applied to all states. We need universal health care for all.
Amen.
We need free education. We need
500. I hate to interrupt, but I just have to say 500,000 North Carolinians have no access to health care. 500,000. 2 to 3 of them die every single day.
Yeah, and you have over 600,000 that if you expanded Medicaid, which the legislature can do without it costing them anything. I mean,
it would bring billions into the state.
Yeah,
right.
and just out of spite or whatever, they don't want to do it. I think it's something like 650,000 North Carolinians could get health care by doing it.
There's a business model. Like, for every dollar spent in supporting early childhood education every dollar spent in ensuring that people have health insurance, like more than $7 would come back per dollar spent, right, back to society. And we would show kind of a reduction in poverty, we'd show a reduction in homelessness, we'd show a reduction in incarceration.
All of it. For every dollar you spend helping lift a poor person up, that person puts back into the economy, and it generates, anywhere from $2 to $7, depending on what the issue is.
It's just so obvious. The stimulus program really helped a lot of people during the pandemic, and I had great hope for the Biden administration.
I did too.
And then the Build Back Better, bill, which got cut from $6 trillion to $3 trillion. And then Joe Manchin tried to cut it down to like $1.5 trillion. And I was so disappointed when Pramila Jayapal and the Progressive Caucus, they were holding the line. That was the hashtag, basically saying they wouldn't vote for the infrastructure bill, which actually privatizes a lot of our infrastructure, unless the Build Back Better bill got a vote. And then they caved. They caved because, Joe Manchin.
Well, because poor people had to have something. They wanted to see that poor people got something. That's why they caved.
Well, will they get anything in the infrastructure bill? I don't know that they will. I think a lot of big companies are going to get a lot of big contracts, and who knows? But the thing was that she said that Joe Biden looked her in the eye. This is Pramila Jayapal, and said he could get Joe Manchin. And then, of course, once Joe Manchin got the infrastructure bill, he said, no, we're not going to do this. And it's like, who voted him into the presidency? But he makes the decisions. And talk about how Reverend Barber has been targeting Joe Manchin. They've had actions where they've actually taken buses into West Virginia.
I would say let's speak to that in just a minute. But I want to say I grew up in West Virginia, and I have a strong affinity for the centuries of injustices the West Virginian people have had to experience. And I want to lift up that the Poor People's Campaign has supported the people of West Virginia to stand up and speak with a strong voice that Joe Manchin is not representing their interests. So I just want to make sure that we lift up the Poor People's Campaign in West Virginia has, it's amazing how it's grown in strength and power in the work that it's been doing this year. I don't know if Leslie, if you want to speak to some of the rallies that you've gone to.
Yeah, I think the first one, you couldn't get there, but we rented a Chevy Suburban and brought like 7 people from Asheville. And there were buses from all over West Virginia, Ohio. And there were probably 2,000 people, I think, that walked up to Manchin's office from the riverfront and stood out in the parking lot. And even though we weren't allowed in the building, we all signed this list of demands. There were probably 1,000 signatures on that thing. So, yes, and I went up again for another rally about 3 months ago, and he's just been targeting him. He's been, I wouldn't even call it targeting. He's been
holding him accountable.
Yes, he's holding him accountable. Yeah. And I just love that he's doing it with such class. I mean, he's not calling him horrible names. He's not, let's have a fist fight. He's saying, Joe Manchin, what you're doing is immoral. And he's the sound of somebody's conscience. And all we can hope is that
he's very popular. He's very popular, and he keeps getting reelected. And I think that there's a lot of people that vote against their economic interests. And this kind of goes in line with what we were talking about before the show. I was asking you about how you reach out to rural voters that tend to vote Republican, that have a steady diet of Fox News and Rush Limbaugh and
Madison Cawthorn.
And Madison Cawthorn. But now it's Tucker Carlson and the evangelical community. Yes, the Poor People's Campaign does have a lot of mainstream religious organizations behind it, but the evangelicals are very big here. I'm just shocked since I moved here a year ago, every other block there's a Baptist church. And I want to know what your conversations with these people are like, what you try to tell them, what they say in return, what the challenges are to try to reach people.
Yeah, and I
Well,
think
I've had you go ahead, Evan.
go ahead. I was going to say, I think I want Leslie to talk about the broad network of faith leaders that we have engaged across Western North Carolina, but I wanted
There
to
are a lot
talk
of
about,
evangelicals.
Yeah.
You know, we have Latino, Black, white, old, young. I mean, such a diversity of people. And a lot of them are evangelical Christians. And when I talk to evangelical Christians, I try to talk about, I mean, I was raised in that tradition. So I try to talk about what Jesus told us to do more than what Jesus told us not to do.
right.
And, you know, I talk about Judgment Day from the book of Matthew, where it talks about Jesus dividing people into goats and sheep. And people who thought that they were among the favored ones were told, no, you're not. You didn't feed the hungry. You didn't heal the sick. You didn't clothe the naked. You didn't visit me in jail. And whatever you did to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it to me. So I like to remind people of that. And I find I do get people to sit down and listen when I talk.
Mm-hmm.
But not many change their minds, but you plant a seed.
Right. Do
Yeah,
you have anything to share on that, Evan?
Well, I was going to say, I think, again, focusing on poverty and the experiences and real stories, telling real stories is really the way. It's getting to people's heart and that sense of morality that they have, particularly if they're people of faith. And I think that that is the opportunity, right, to find a common thread. So many, I think the one of the pieces of the Poor People's Campaign is one of the injustices is a false moral narrative that tells the story that poor people are responsible for the situation that they're in. If they only worked harder, if they only, stopped having children, if they only, all of the different things that they are doing, right, that are contributing to this situation, rather than looking at the system and looking at the policies and the laws.
I can guess somebody's political bent by their reaction to my son's story. My son died because he didn't have access to health care. And I can tell your political bent by whether you say, oh my God, I'm so sorry, or was he working when he got sick? Pat McCrory asked me that while he was still governor. And I asked him when he signed the death penalty into law for unemployment. And his response was, some people just want a handout. So I had to remind him that healthcare is a basic human right and never a handout.
Right.
I also told him I thought that view was fascist. So
that which is probably not going to turn somebody around.
But then he hasn't forgotten me.
Well, and he's not the worst of them. Apparently, he's now considered like the moderate Republican running for,
Yeah. I did want to say that I think that one of the things that's important to lift up here is that really, if you look back over history, every time that poor people have come together across color, race, ethnicity lines to take action against the wealthy people in this country, we have seen an entrenchment in a codification in the law of racism. We have seen basically disenfranchising and taking away power from really primarily it impacts the BIPOC folks more, and at the same time we have this part of that false moral narrative is that it kind of invites poor white people to vote for candidates that when they get elected in office, just as you were saying earlier, Lauren, they put in place policies that hurt them. And so when we can start pointing out that there are, if it's 1 million North Carolinians who do not have Medicaid, right, who don't have health insurance, disproportionately, this impacts BIPOC folks. And by raw numbers, it is so many more poor white people. And so again, when you start really helping people understand and open up the fact that we're in this together, right? Poverty is not a racial issue. Poverty is not an ethnic issue. It is, or an LGBTQ issue. It's a public policy issue.
Yeah. Talk about some of the public policies that you've been able to influence. Do you have any success stories in any any venue, a municipality, a state, federally, anything that
Pat
you?
McCrory was a one-term governor. We did that.
Mm,
We changed the narrative, and he couldn't change it back because we had the stories. We had the heart. And he was a one-term governor. And while we didn't win back the majority because it's so gerrymandered, they no longer have, a supermajority. So we've made an impact. Have we changed everything? No. But then again, the U.S. Revolution was not a 2-year election cycle victory, nor was women winning the right to vote, nor was the civil rights movement. Movements take time. And it's hard to be patient, but movements take time. And we just have to, if it doesn't come before I die, there are younger people willing to step into my place when I go, and I know it.
I would say that the Poor People's Campaign, among many other partners in the state, have really contributed to the kind of lifting up the gerrymandering and the voter suppression, such that we became the test case, right, for the United States in terms of the Supreme Court ruling that resulted in a redistricting of or redrawing of the lines. And we're that fight is never over. But
right.
I know the Poor People's Campaign has really made a difference there. I would say that the Poor People's Campaign, the thing that I think, again, getting back to strategy, the thing that I really appreciate is that there is a policy team that is constantly looking at data and kind of looking at policy and really digging deep to understand both what is a strategy for works, what would a moral budget for the United States look like, and pulling in suggestions.
And we drafted one.
We have drafted one and recommendations that are actually have evidence behind them. But then also leading up to this last election, presidential election, the Poor People's Campaign's efforts were so focused on 10 states that made a difference. I think we contributed to the outcome of the election in such a way that the policies and the platforms made their way. If you look at some of the original bills that the Biden administration introduced into Congress, so much of that came from this deep policy work that the Poor People's Campaign was doing.
Yeah.
It's just a shame that, there's so much he could do by executive action that he's not doing. And, we knew that he didn't support single payer Medicare for all, but he did support the public option. And just like Obama, he's thrown it under the bus. It hasn't been mentioned at all. He talked about canceling $10,000 worth of student debt, which is nothing. He should be forgiving it all. But now he's backed off on even that. And now, of course, with this war, it seems like we're going backwards. More money is going to the weapons manufacturers, fossil fuel industry. Everybody's now talking drill, baby, drill again.
Yeah.
I have a kind of a cynical view about this, and I talked about it in my last show. I won't talk about it too much, except to say that, the show that I did, it was, the Russian invasion was not unprovoked, not that it wasn't criminal and a war crime and aggressive and horrific, et cetera, but to keep calling it unprovoked, this was a line in the sand that Putin had for ages, and many strategists, including conservative ones, such as Henry Kissinger and George Kennan, who's the author of the original Soviet containment policy, and even William Burns, our current CIA director, said in 2009, trying to push Ukraine to join NATO is a line too far. And so I think, and Michael Hudson has a theory, an economist, that, he said, we've defeated Germany for the third time, meaning Germany was starting to get very dependent on Russian gas. They had 40% of their gas from Russia. Now with the Nord Stream 2 going online, it was going to be 80%. And we want to sell them our LNG, or liquefied natural gas, since Obama quadrupled fracking. But anyway, of course, now that the war started, they canceled that Nord Stream 2 right away. And Germany and France fell in line. And it's kind of like these hegemons, you know, we've been so used to, since the fall of the Soviet Union, this unipolar society. And now they're, you know, they were revving up this Cold War, which we're now seeing could easily turn into a hot war if we get this no-fly zone that so many liberals are clamoring for. It means World War III. And, you know, we've made a boogeyman out of China, too, because we have to be the big, you know, kahuna or whatever. But anyway, I digress.
Well, it's
Yeah,
a class.
we have
It's
to
a
have the
classic
most
myth.
testosterone on the block. That's what we have to do.
It's also a classic myth, and it's been an intentional strategy in the United States to continue to like that threat, right? The outside threat that we need to ward off. And meanwhile, we are actually actively harming and committing the violence, that disproportional violence that communities are, poor and low wealth communities and BIPOC communities are subjected to and have been for hundreds of years, is not something that we do anything about. And it's immoral, and it's got to stop. The Poor People's Campaign, I will say that the thing about being part of the Poor People's Campaign is that reminder. Reverend Barber is often reminding us that as long as there's been injustice and evil, there has been a resistance, there has been a movement, and that the long arc of justice, which Martin Luther King talks about, that, you know, we're only going to get there if we keep organizing, mobilizing, waking the sleeping giant. What the Poor People's Campaign has done a lot of analysis of voter turnout, and if just 1% of poor and low wealth voters in key states in this country actually got registered and went to the polls and voted for the candidates, regardless of party, right, that were going to result in the policies that would actually benefit them, it would be revolutionary in this country, right?
Well, that was what I thought the Bernie Sanders campaign was based on. And we had, you know, I ran LA for Bernie, and we had a low income outreach program. And we went to Walmart and Target and the dollar stores, check cashing places, payday lenders, where these non-voters are. And we would say, yeah, we know why you don't vote, because neither party represents you. They represent the privileged class. But there's this one man who has been concerned about you for 40 years, for his entire career. Yeah. And, you know, that's the problem, you know, I think with the Democratic Party right now, is they push these establishment types, these corporate Democrats, these neoliberals.
And they managed to get them through the primaries. The primaries are structured to put these people on the ballot.
You know, like Charles Booker, who, you know, probably he might have been able to beat Mitch McConnell, and look how incredible that would have been. He almost beat Amy McGrath. It was the most expensive Senate race in the history of Senate races, and she still couldn't win. You know, and you talk about
the same with Cal Cunningham in North Carolina. They pitted him against Erica Smith, who was ahead of Tom Tillis in the polls, when the National Democratic Party went to Cal Cunningham and said, we want you to run. I mean, God forbid a woman, especially a woman of color, should enter the Senate. Right. And they poured a lot of money into it, and he just couldn't behave himself even until the election.
Yeah, well, look, now they've got their woman of color, the Sherry Beasley, who doesn't stand for anything, who is not for single payer, who doesn't seem to have
she's not.
She doesn't have a command of the issues. She will not do town halls. She will only do controlled private events. And they think, you know, that particular woman of color they like, but not Erica Smith, who's a real progressive firebrand.
I love Erica.
Let's talk about, I'm going to try to roll in this promo that Evan sent me. Let's see if this works. I'm going to try to share the screen here. Because I've got it all queued up, and let's see if this works. Let's see if you get the audio. See if we can hear this.
The members of the General Assembly are mortals and not God. The members of the Congress, they are mortals, not God. bowing down is not enough.
Remember that the roots of Moral Monday began right here 8 years ago. We ask you to join us on March 28th for a Moral Monday revival.
We will stand up again. We will march again. We will preach again. We will organize again.
We are going to put a face on the tragedy of the bills that keep our people down, keep our people oppressed. Regionally, Virginia and South Carolina will be bringing our people to join with us. We say we were born for a time like this. We must come together.
We are black, we are white, we are Latino, we are Native American, we are Democrat, we are Republican, we are independent, we are people of faith, we are people not of faith, we are natives and immigrants, we are business leaders and workers and unemployed, we are doctors and the uninsured, we are gay, we are straight, we are students, we are parents, we are retirees. We are North Carolina. We are America. And we're here and we ain't going nowhere.
Well, I had to go out of the room and look on my tablet to make sure it worked, and it worked. So
Yay, thank you.
I finally figured out how to roll in a video to this show. It's only been 5 years that I've been doing my show.
How
Anyway.
quickly you learn.
I know. Anyway,
Well,
so
it's funny. These promos, all these historical videos, I find myself in almost every one of them.
yeah, I gotta look for you next time.
I was one of the ones with the gravestones behind me in the healthcare demonstration.
Okay. Talk about the event and how people can go.
Yeah, so this event on the 28th is part of what's called a MORE tour: mobilize, organize, register, and educate. And the goal is to actually build momentum for the June 18th event. We are showing up in Raleigh. We want to bring, I think we've got currently 6 buses that will be bringing people from all over North Carolina. We have a bus that's available that's leaving both from Silva and Asheville. And so you just need to get yourself to either of those locations. You can get on the bus. Those of you who there's a way to go and be able to register for free. We want to make sure that all individuals who want to be there can be there. We're raising money. We're seeking donations for people who, even if you can afford your seat on the bus, we'd love for you to donate. So particularly poor and low wealth community members and neighbors can join us.
Yeah, I'm going to do that. I'm not going to be able to make it, so I'm going to sponsor a couple of people to go on the bus.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
It's so important because, we're doing this. This is all done for and by poor people. And we want poor people to be able to get there. I know I've lived in pretty bad poverty when my kids were little. And I couldn't have gotten on a bus without somebody saying, here, take a seat. I never would have been able to.
And I
it's
have
a
to say,
long day, right? I mean, you have to. The bus leaves Asheville at 1:00, and I think the rally is
it's Silva before then, because it starts in Silva and then comes to Asheville. And the rally starts at 5. It's 5:00 to gather. 5:30 is the rally, and then
they'll be singing and chanting and stuff before the rally actually begins. Reverend Barber will be there. So I know a lot of people don't want to come if he's not going to be there, but even when he's not there, it's always good. But he will be there.
And then afterwards, the bus comes right back, right?
It comes back, so it's basically there and back in the day.
I
will say, I want to say that I don't have the list in front of me, and I should, because I hate to leave out anyone, but I do want folks to know that we have some partners in Western North Carolina that are all in. And so the Racial Justice Coalition, Fight for 15, Just Economics is in, Beloved Asheville is in, the Jackson County NAACP chapter. I'm going to go ahead and hand off to you, Leslie, to list some more.
Yancy Mitchell, the Yancy Mitchell chapter. I think you caught most of them. Hope I didn't forget anyone.
Now, this is not.
Democracy NC are also.
That's right, Democracy NC.
All in partners.
Now,
and El Centro.
This is not going to be an arrestable action, right?
Nope.
No, we're not doing any direct action. This is
a
just
peaceful
a rally, a Moral Monday rally with no risk of arrest.
Yeah, Evan, Leslie knows this. You don't know this, but I was actually arrested covering the Poor People's Campaign disruption of the California Senate in the summer of 2018. I had covered, the start of the Poor People's Campaign in Los Angeles at a church. And then that summer, they were going up there 5 or maybe 6 weekends in a row. Each weekend was going to feature a different issue. And I was like, I'm going to go up there. I'm going to cover this. Finally, it was the last weekend. And I said, this is my last chance. I went up there with 2 friends, had no intention of getting arrested. Had my pocketbook on my arm, my phone, my jewelry, everything. And I was in the gallery across from everybody. When they started to chant and sing and drop their banner and disrupt, I turned on my phone camera and I started live streaming. And damned if I wasn't the first one targeted. They told me that, if I didn't leave the gallery, and they didn't call it an unlawful arrest at that point, by the way, but everybody else voluntarily left. And I said, no, I'm press. And they said, I don't care. You have to leave. And I said, well, you have to leave now. This is your second warning or you're going to be arrested. And I said, fine, I'll live stream my arrest. And it was just, I decided to make a stand because I thought it was so awful. Clearly, the reason they targeted me was they didn't want me to show what everybody was doing and how they were going to be arrested. And they were kind of brutal, I have to say. And they made an example of us. Other people were just cited and released in previous weeks. But this last weekend, they took us down to the basement. They drove us in buses to the California Highway Patrol offices. We sat there from 2 p.m. till 6 in handcuffs. They processed us and they took us to the county jail. We sat there more in handcuffs. They finally took the handcuffs off, brought us into the cell. And there were at least 6 pastors in my cell. And we sang, hymns, and we did yoga exercises, and we were having a great old time. Those jailers,
That's kind of what we did.
They couldn't understand why we were so happy, but we were obviously making the most of it, and we thought this was a righteous cause. And finally, at midnight, after being in custody since 2 p.m, they let us out. They held the men until 6 a.m. the next morning, though. But
they told us we couldn't sing. So
really?
They told us we were making too much noise, and we said, I'm sorry, but I didn't know we couldn't sing. And the first time we were arrested, we were kept in an open area instead of being put in a cell, and they told us we couldn't sing. So somebody started tapping on our leg and chanting freedom in this really beautiful beat. And pretty soon we were all just kind of whispering, freedom.
Yeah.
Freedom.
Now, before we go, why is civil disobedience so important?
To me, it means we're not afraid.
It's a powerful thing to stand up and be willing to actually break the law, so to speak, in really a witness to the fact that you think the laws that exist are immoral. And so to me, it's part of the tradition, I think dating back to the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King and the nonviolence. Civil disobedience is nonviolent resistance. And to be honest, it goes back to the days of Jesus, right? Jesus spoke truth to power. And a lot of what Jesus did was creative opposition. I don't know if you've heard Walter Wink speak about kind of the history of nonviolence in the world, and we don't hear the stories about how successful nonviolence has been historically. And so the kind of Bible story of turn the other cheek, right? And so that was really in opposition. And back in the day, right, you had one hand that you used to clean yourself after you went to the bathroom, and it was, you dishonored yourself if you actually touched someone with that dirty hand. When you turned the other cheek, you were forcing that person to use their dirty hand to hit you. So that it's creative opposition, and it's really standing up to say this is an immoral law, and I'm
Yeah.
willing to put my life and my safety on the line.
Yeah, and I read it. It wasn't a textbook, but it was pretty academic by Erica Chenoweth about how nonviolent revolutions have always been much more successful than those violent ones. And of course, I think it was John Lewis had that expression, "beautiful trouble."
Yeah, or good trouble, good trouble.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I think it was a book that I got from
There
a
is a
friend.
book called Beautiful Trouble.
An
Somebody gave it to me.
activist in LA gave me that book, Beautiful Trouble, with all sorts of interesting creative protest ideas. But anyway, we've got to leave it at that. I've really enjoyed talking to you ladies, and I'm very excited for next week. Is there any final thoughts you want to leave the audience with?
Yes, go to the website, poorpeoplescampaign.org. You can sign up for your state there. You can, if you can go to, what's our website? ppc-nc.org.
What is
So,
it? I'll put it on the thing. PPC
dash nc.org.
dash as in like hyphen or back?
Yes. Hyphen.
Yeah, hyphen. Also, we're on Facebook, the North Carolina. Pardon me?
PPCWNC.org.
No, ppc-nc.org is the state Poor
NC.
People's Campaign.
Okay.
It's the North
webpage.
Carolina Poor People's Campaign.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. And we're on Facebook, both the North Carolina and the Western region.
Okay, so if they go to that website, they can find the link to sign up for the bus.
Yeah, they sign up for the march, sign up for the bus. Yes. And
All
I
right,
would
Even
everybody.
sign up to donate.
All right,
I would just-
everybody, you know what you're tasked with doing. You got to get on that bus, Western North
Get on the
Carolina.
bus, man. This is just going to be so huge.
Okay. All right. Thank you both very much.
Thank you,
so
Lauren.
much, Lauren. Have a great
really
night.
appreciate it.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.